Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here with you. Thanks for the invitation to come by and share a few thoughts about ALEC's priorities and policy perspectives and what I can add to it. I was delighted to meet Speaker Craddock from Texas and his wonderful spouse, Nadine. I was 7 when the Speaker first became a legislator, and I've been following his career ever since. But I suspect in his case, like in my case, Nadine keeps him on track, keeps him within the guardrails of life, and I have that same influence in my life with my wonderful spouse, Mary, who I wish could be with us today. But she has a wonderful way of keeping things in perspective. We were out at our Egan home outside of St. Paul, Minnesota, some months ago, and I was standing in the bathroom looking in the mirror after a particularly tough week at the legislature. I mean, I was beaten down, discouraged, none of my stuff was moving. There was a lot of tension going on back and forth between the administration and the legislature. And I was looking in the mirror. I said, "Oh, Mary, look at me." I said, "My hairline's receding. My hair is starting to turn gray. These crow's feet on the corner of my eye are multiplying and deepening by the week. I have been on the road nonstop, eating junk food all over the country. I have not been exercising. I'm turning into Flabby Man. And these love handles are starting to flop over the side of my belt." I said, "Is there anything you can tell me that would be positive or encouraging or hopeful?" And she looked at me and she said, "Well, yeah, man, there's nothing wrong with your eyesight." So now, it's just a little story about keeping things in perspective. And you all know, because we hear about it every day, every hour on the news media, that our country is facing some challenges and people are concerned, and understandably so. These are real challenges, and they are squeezing our citizens and the people that we serve in very acute and hard ways. And that makes it all the more important for those of us who have a chance to be in public service and to be in public leadership to try even harder to come up with ideas and approaches that will help relieve some of that pressure. And I think ALEC is an organization that has been on the front and center of that debate for many years and many decades, and we appreciate your work, and I'm glad that you're gathered here to exchange best practices, exchange ideas, and I'd like to just share a few of my own with you by way of example. But I tell you that story about my wife, Mary, in part because even though we have challenges, even though we have headaches, and even though there will for sure be some more bumps in the road to come, I think it's important that each of us individually and all of us collectively step back and from time to time remember that we also live in a great country, that we live in the freest and most prosperous country in the history of the world. There are no people, any place, anywhere, anytime that have experienced more freedom and more liberty and more prosperity than those of us fortunate enough to live in the United States of America in these times. So I also want to say that our country has seen challenge before. Our country has seen roadblocks and hurdles before, and we can overcome these. We can do this if we work together and we properly diagnose the problems and challenges of our time and realize they're going to also require some modernization and some changes of how we move forward. And I'd like to just share a few examples of that today. A Minnesotan that you have, I'm sure, heard of is Thomas Friedman. He grew up in Minnesota. We lost him to Brandeis University and ultimately to the New York Times. Now, he's not necessarily a conservative, but he's got some wonderful books out that I'm sure you've read or heard about. One is called The World is Flat, and people are tired of hearing about this in many respects, but the book says that some time ago the United States had comparative advantage because we somewhat uniquely had access to the tools of communication and collaboration and real-time interaction and data storage and data transmission and on down the road. The rest of the world, or much of the rest of the world, didn't have access to those tools because they were either then too expensive, or the countries involved or their governments or businesses didn't have the resources to purchase them or acquire them, and even if they did, they weren't particularly interested in deploying them or embedding them very deeply or broadly across their economy or across their enterprise. And you know the rest of the story. That has all changed, hasn't it? And now, as Friedman says in his book, and others have clearly observed, the rest of the world, or much of it, has access to those same tools. They can do much of the same things that we do, Except in this hyper-competitive global economy, it's a real threat to America when they work for 10 or 20 cents on the dollar. And this is no longer limited to low-skill manufacturing functions. This is now migrating up the hierarchy of jobs into engineering and computer programming and architecture and law and many, many other aspects, most other aspects of our economy. So Friedman finished his first book on a skeptical note. He was quite cynical about the future of the United States and our ability to meet this challenge. And then he got out of Washington and New York and drove around the heartland of the country, talked to some folks, and particularly in small businesses and entrepreneurs and others, and he went back in a not very well-reported second edition of the book and wrote a prologue. And it was dramatically more hopeful, dramatically more positive than the conclusion and tone of the first edition. And he said, in essence, and I'm paraphrasing, that after traveling around the country, after meeting these inventors and designers and engineers and entrepreneurs and dreamers and artists, he said, I now believe we're going to fare really well in this competition. And he said, the secret to America's success in this global competition is that we are the great dream machine. That unlike other cultures, unlike other countries, the degree to which we have experienced freedom, the degree to which we have experienced liberty, what that means and what it breeds in our people in terms of creativity, innovative spirit, risk-taking, tolerance for entrepreneurial activities, invention, design, and the like, is a quantum difference than much of the rest of the world. And at the core of all of that is freedom and liberty. And so I know sometimes those words, those concepts get jumped over because we get into the mechanics of a piece of legislation, or we get into the debate of the day over this amendment or this bill to pay or this thing. But we should not forget that we are the most prosperous, most successful nation in the history of the world because we're also the freest country in the history of the world. And at the heart of what we talk about has to be principles of freedom and liberty and the like. Now, another person that you may have heard of, Peter Drucker, who died unfortunately a few years ago, but was a grand strategic thinker. Most people in business and other enterprise view him as one of the most profound strategic thinkers of our time. And he said this about the future: the things that got us here will not get us there. That we cannot have as a strategic plan for the future the status quo plus inflation. That nostalgia is not a strategic plan. And so we have a lot of work to do. And he also lived long enough to hear about Friedman's book, In the World is Flat. The woman who wrote the last book about Peter Drucker, who interviewed him over the course of the last 2 years of his life as he knew he was in the twilight of his life, asked him in a book called The Definitive Drucker, what do you think of Friedman's concept, the world is flat? And you know what he said? Not for very long. And I'm paraphrasing, but the essence of his comments were, this idea that everything's going to be the same everywhere and there won't be comparative advantage is hooey. That there will always be comparative advantage in a competitive environment, that countries and regions and cities and businesses will strive in a competitive environment to get a comparative advantage. And the notion that the world is flat in that regard, in Drucker's view, is incomplete. And so one thing that I think we have to do as policymakers at the state level, national level, and other levels is ask ourselves with great clarity and be able to respond with great clarity, what is our comparative advantage in this hyper-competitive global economy?